Did the Israelites invent Yahweh, or was their God worshipped long before they even existed? This video dives into the fascinating history of Yahweh worship, exploring evidence of its existence in ancient societies, predating the rise of Israel. Everything you thought you knew about the origins of monotheism may be wrong. Join us as we explore the shocking evidence of Yahweh worship before the Israelites, a revelation that rewrites our understanding of religious history. What secrets lie buried in the sands of time? This video unravels a captivating mystery: the existence of Yahweh worship long before the rise of the Israelite nation. Uncover the hidden history of a God who transcends time and culture. Now, if you're familiar with my work, then you know I love digging into historical records to see what clues we can find about the nature of God and how humanity has understood the divine throughout history. And there are few topics that have fascinated me more than the early worship of Yahweh. So join me as we look at what historians have discovered pointing to the worship of Yahweh thousands of years before the nation of Israel even existed. So let's dive right into it. Before we get into the main topic, I need to answer a very basic question, which is, what do we mean when we say Yahweh? Now, the name Yahweh comes from the four letters Yod He Wah in the Hebrew language. These four letters are a pronunciation nightmare for English speakers, but most scholars agree that the pronunciation is Yahweh. However, these four letters also represent the name of God according to Exodus chapter 3, verses 14 to 15. And this passage is one of the foundations of the monotheistic religions. In fact, many Christians believe that this passage proves the existence of a personal God who is all-powerful. Let me read it for you. Then he said, I am who I am. And he said, Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And God spoke further to Moses, saying, Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. As we can see here, Yahweh appears to be a personal God who chose Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as his people. So if Yahweh is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were Jews, does that mean that Yahweh worship began with the Jews? Not quite. As we continue our journey back in time, we find ourselves in Mesopotamia around 2000 BC, where we meet a man named Abraham. Abraham is considered the patriarch of Judaism, the man to whom God made the promises concerning his offspring becoming a great nation. But Abraham didn't just come out of nowhere. He had a father. His father's name was Terah, and he lived in a city called Ur. Ur is located in southern Mesopotamia near the Persian Gulf. It was a major city in Mesopotamia with strong connections to the surrounding regions. It was also home to polytheistic religions that likely influenced Abraham during his childhood. But we can't stop there. We need to go farther back. Terah's father was a man named Nahor, and Nahor's father was a man named Serug. Together, they form what scholars call the patriarchal line of Shem. This line traces back to the biblical figure Shem, son of Noah, the man who built the ark and survived the great flood. Each generation moves us farther back in time. Each generation brings us closer to the dawn of civilization. But sadly, each generation brings us farther away from written records. Let's stop for a moment and think about what we've just covered. According to the Bible, Abraham was born in Ur. Ur was located in southern Mesopotamia. Abraham's ancestors lived in southern Mesopotamia, and Abraham's great-grandfather, Serug, traced his ancestry back to Noah, who supposedly survived the Great Flood. If this is true, then Abraham lived thousands of years before the Israelites ever became a nation. If this is true, then Abraham was not an Israelite, because Israel did not exist yet. Abraham's descendants, Isaac and Jacob, would eventually become the nation of Israel. But Abraham himself was not an Israelite. Abraham, King Self, was not an Israelite. So if we want to understand how the Israelites came to worship Yahweh, we must first understand how the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob came to worship Yahweh. So remember what I said about moving farther back in time, farther back in history. Well, we're going to do just that now. We're going to take our study of Yahweh worship back another 1,000 years or so. Our next stop takes us to northern Mesopotamia in the ancient city of Mari. Mari was a hub of activity during the 18th century BC, and it was during this time that a group of people known as the Amorites invaded the city and destroyed much of its infrastructure. This invasion left behind a wealth of archaeological material that historians are still uncovering today. The ruins of Mari were only discovered in the 1930s, and excavations have continued intermittently since then. But it was the discovery of clay tablets in the ruins of Mari that gave us our earliest glimpse into the worship of Yahweh. Among these tablets was one that listed various gods, including one that was spelled out in a very interesting way. The tablet contained a list of Mesopotamian deities, and the majority of the names was spelled out phonetically. That is to say, the cuneiform symbols were used to represent the sounds of the language. However, there was one name on the list that was not spelled out phonetically. This name was Yar, U-W-R, and it is believed to be the name of Yahweh. This is important because it shows that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was known by name in Mesopotamia. It shows that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was known by name in Mesopotamia. But what does the name Yah mean? The truth is we don't know for sure. However, scholars have speculated that it may mean he causes to exist, or he brings into being. If this is true, then we can see a possible connection between Yahweh and the creation of the world. This fits with what we know of Yahweh as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because he is often depicted as a creator God. In Genesis chapter 1, for example, we see Yahweh creating the world in 6 days and resting on the 7th day. Unfortunately, the Mari goddess list is not our only evidence of Yahweh worship in Mesopotamia. Another piece of evidence that supports the worship of Yahweh in Mesopotamia is a hymn that was found in the ruins of the ancient city of Imar. Imar was another major city in Mesopotamia, and it was home to a variety of different gods and goddesses. However, among the many gods and goddesses that were worshipped in Imar, there was one god who stood out from the rest. This god was Yah, and he was clearly different from the other gods in Imar. In this hymn, we see Yah being praised as a creator God who brings salvation to his people. He is also described as being a warrior who fights on behalf of his people. And finally, he is depicted as a shepherd who cares for his sheep. This is significant because it shows that Yahweh was seen as more than just a deity. He was seen as a father figure who cared for his people. He was a warrior who fought on behalf of his people. He was a king who ruled over his people. He was a shepherd who guided his people. But why is this important? It's important because it helps us to understand the nature of Yahweh worship in Mesopotamia. Yahweh was not seen as just one God among many. He was seen as the supreme God who was greater than all of the other gods. So what does this all mean? What does it mean to find evidence of Yahweh worship in Mesopotamia? It means that Yahweh was not invented by the Israelites. He was worshipped long before Israel became a nation. It means that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was known by name in Mesopotamia. It means that Yahweh was seen as a supreme God who was greater than all of the other gods. It means that Yahweh was seen as a creator God, a warrior God, a father God, a king God, a shepherd God. However, there's still so much more to discover. There's still so much more to learn about Yahweh and his worship. So stay tuned for part 2. This is part 2 of our exploration into the origins of Yahweh. In part 1, we laid out some possibilities about how Yahweh may have originated in the religious beliefs of the ancient Israelites. We mentioned the possibility that Yahweh was a weather god, drawing upon parallels with other ancient deities, and the fact that many of the stories in the Torah seem to reflect an agrarian society. We also considered the idea that the Israelite tribes were originally nomadic, moving from place to place following their flocks and herds, and we noted that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob seems to have been more of an ethical monotheism initially, but over time the Israelites came to conceive of him more anthropomorphically. Now in part 2, we're going to look at the evidence for these ideas. What archaeological finds or ancient texts shed light on the origins of Yahweh? Remember, we are trying to piece together the very early history of Yahweh, which means we are dealing with pre-literate times, and thus there are no contemporary written records from the Israelites themselves. Our only resources are what archaeologists have found and how later writers allude to the traditions they knew. So let's dive in. The first clue we have comes from archaeology, specifically the discovery of 2 ancient inscriptions that mention Yahweh. The first is the Tel Dan stele. This black basalt stone slab was discovered in 1993 by archaeologists from the Israel Antiquities Authority at the site of Tel Dan in northern Israel. Since then, it has become one of the most controversial pieces of archaeological evidence ever found. Why is that? Because it contains the first extra-biblical reference to Yahweh. The inscription dates back to the 9th century BCE, so it's from the time of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. It reads, "And I will wipe out the memory of the house of David and all the offspring of Jesse, your house, O King of Israel, and I will bring ruin upon the offspring of Eliada, whom Jesse, he conceived a son, and I will establish the dynasty of David over Israel forever. I am Yahweh, and there shall be no one who can set aside my words and my decrees." Scholars generally agree that the reference to Yahweh is genuine, but there's debate as to whether the rest of the inscription is. Some think it's a prophecy foretelling the destruction of the house of David. Others think it's a boastful inscription by a conquering king. The biggest controversy, however, surrounds the name Yahweh. How does it appear here? Some think the tetragrammaton YHWH appears as four letters carved into the stone, while others think it was originally written in a more common form, Yah, as in the name of the high god in ancient Canaanite religion. If the latter is true, then the use of Yah would date back even further. So why the controversy? Well, it's because of what the text says next. It seems to say that the king is destroying the house of David. But wait, that couldn't have happened until the 6th century BCE, when the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple and took King Jehoiachin into exile. But this inscription is from the 9th century. Does that mean we need to redate the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem? Not necessarily. Perhaps the inscription is referring to a different royal house, or perhaps it's just boasting. There could be some literary device at work here. Maybe it's hyperbole or a boastful claim. Whatever the case, the inscription shows that Yah was known outside of Israel proper. The Canaanites used Yah and Yahweh in their own religious traditions. Our second inscription is even older, and it hails from Kuntalet Adrid in Sinai, dating back to the 9th or 8th century BCE. This small fragment of a broken pottery shard bears an inscription of 2 lines. The first line reads, "I belong to Yahweh," and the second line reads, "May Yahweh rebuke Horemheb and Shiphanan and punish the wicked of Egypt." So both lines mention Yahweh, which suggests that the worship of Yahweh had spread to the Sinai Peninsula by this time. Who are these people mentioned here? Horemheb and Shephnehov are the names of 2 Egyptian pharaohs, one from the 14th century and one from the 13th. And if this inscription is anything to go by, people as far away as the Sinai Peninsula were familiar with Yahweh. But remember, we're trying to understand the very earliest conceptions of Yahweh. These 2 inscriptions don't help us with that, but they do show that Yahweh worship was spreading throughout the region. So now let's turn to the texts. Is there anything in the Bible itself that sheds light on the origins of Yahweh? First, consider Psalm 82. This psalm begins with the words, "God has stood in the congregation of the gods." What does that mean? Well, it depends on how you interpret the word gods. If you take the word literally, then it seems to say that Yahweh once assembled the gods and held a council with them. But if gods means something else, like mighty ones, then it's saying that God held a council with his mighty ones. Either way, there are multiple divine beings present here. Some scholars believe that Psalm 82 alludes to a time when Yahweh was one God among many, and the psalmist is saying that he alone is truly righteous. Other scholars disagree, arguing that Psalm 82 doesn't refer to other gods, but instead refers to human magistrates and judges. What do you think? Look at verse 6. It reads, "I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, yet you shall die like mortals and fall like one of the princes." To me, this sounds like the psalmist is referring to other gods. He calls them gods, but then reminds them that they will die like humans. So it seems there was a time when Yahweh was conceived of alongside other gods. But what about the beginning of the Torah? In Genesis, the Elohim is plural. It reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form, void, and empty, and darkness was over the face of the deep. and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So right away we see the plural gods. Later, though, Moses is called before God, who identifies himself as Yahweh. When Moses asks who he should say sent him, God replies, I am who I am. And he tells Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. So we have a shift from the Elohim to Yahweh. What's going on here? Was Yahweh originally a member of the Elohim, and then he became the sole God of Israel? Or was he always the one true God, and the Elohim were just another group of gods that the Israelites encountered? Unfortunately, we just don't know, but the shift in language is interesting. Could it be that the authoress of Genesis were writing down traditions they knew about a pantheon of gods in which Yahweh played a prominent role? Again, we just don't know. Another fascinating passage is Exodus 15:11, where Moses sings a victory song after the Israelites escape from the Egyptians. It reads, Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness, awesome in praises, who brings justice and salvation? Here we see another parallel to Psalm 82. Moses is reminding Yahweh that among all the gods, none are like him. He's great, holy, praiseworthy, just, and a savior. So again, it seems there was a time when Yahweh was conceived of alongside other gods, but Yahweh was greater than all of them. As we wrap up, let's think about what we've learned. From archaeology, we see that the worship of Yahweh was widespread throughout the ancient Near East long before the time of David. And from the biblical texts themselves, we see that early Israelite religion likely had a pluralistic understanding of the divine, but that Yahweh was clearly one of those gods, and perhaps the most important. So now that we've uncovered the evidence, in part 3, we'll pull everything together and offer up some conclusions. What do we really know about the origins of Yahweh? Be sure to join us for part 3. Now this is one of those topics that can be very sensitive for some people, and so my hope is that we can talk about this in a way that is respectful and charitable to all sides of this discussion. So today we're going to be looking at what is called the Yahweh in Canaan theory, and then also what I'm calling the Israelite exclusivity theory. And so let's just get started. So the first thing we need to do is define our terms. And the term we need to define our terms by is Yahweh. Now you might know Yahweh as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the Israelites, the God of Israel, Jesus Christ, etc. But the term Yahweh itself is actually just a name. It's the name that God gave to Moses up on Mount Sinai when he said, Thus shall you say to the children of Israel, Yahweh, God of your fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob has sent me to you. So Yahweh is simply the name of God as revealed to Moses. It doesn't tell us anything about attributes. It doesn't tell us anything about theology. It just tells us his name. Now, in this video, when I refer to Yahweh, I am referring to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel, because that's the only Yahweh that we know about from the text. That's how they referred to him, and that's how I'm going to refer to him. So that's just the first thing we need to define. We're not talking about any old God here. We are specifically talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so with that in mind, let's look at these two theories. The first theory is called the Yahweh in Canaan theory. This theory basically says that before Israel became a nation, before Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were called by God, there were already people in the land of Canaan who worshipped Yahweh. So this means that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was not unique to them. There were other people who knew him and worshipped him. Now, in order for this theory to work, there needs to be evidence of Yahweh worship outside of the family line of Abraham. Before Abraham had faith in Yahweh, and the main piece of evidence that proponents of this theory point to is Exodus 3-6 and 7. When Moses was tending sheep in the wilderness of Midian, he saw a bush that was on fire, but was not consumed. And so he went over to see it, and God called to him out of the bush, and said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. But notice what the text does not say. It does not say that he was the God of the Kenites, the Midianites, or the Amalekites. It simply says that he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the theory says that there was a connection there. Well, what's interesting is that the author of Hebrews picks up on that same event and says this about it. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months by Pharaoh's daughter, even as the Israelites afterwards worshipped other gods and followed after various practices. So the author of Hebrews seems to indicate that the Egyptians were worshipping Yahweh at this point. And if that's true, then the Israelites were not exclusive in their worship of Yahweh. However, the evidence for this theory goes back much further than the time of Moses. In Genesis chapter 14, we read about a war that took place in the Valley of the Kings. For kings fought against 5, and the kings who fought against the 4 were Abram, who would later become Abraham, together with his nephew Lot, along with the king of Elam, the king of Elam, and the king of Gedor. And so after they defeated the 4 kings, the Bible says that Abram blessed the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. But then it says something else. It says, and he gave him tithes of all. And in that day Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. So we have someone here named Melchizedek who is a priest of the Most High God. And so many people have pointed to this passage as evidence that there was already an existing religion in Canaan that worshipped the Most High God, and that Abraham came into contact with that religion and maybe even adopted some of it. However, the evidence is far from conclusive. You could argue that Abraham simply stopped and worshipped God at a random place, and that's why he was giving thanks to the Most High God. Or you could argue that he was actually interacting with a local deity who was actually Yahweh. Many scholars believe that Melchizedek was actually Yahweh himself. So the question is, was Abraham truly worshipping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or was he simply worshipping God in a way that was more generic? The final bit of evidence the proponents of the Yahweh in Canaan theory point to is Deuteronomy 4:39. Here Moses is telling the Israelites that they should know that the gods of the nations round them are nothing, and he gives them an example of one of these gods. He says, "Know therefore today, and lay it to your heart that God is God in heaven above, and on the earth beneath. There is no other. Then Moses uses an example, and he says, "The Lord, He is God in heaven above, and on the earth beneath. There is none beside Him." So here Moses is saying that while there are many gods of the nations around Israel, Yahweh is the only true God. But notice what he does not say. He does not say that the nations around Israel did not worship Yahweh. So some people take that to mean that the surrounding nations did indeed worship Yahweh, but they just didn't know that He was the one true God. However, this verse has a lot of problems. For one, it's Deuteronomic history. That means it was written long after Deuteronomy was written. Deuteronomy was written during the reign of King Josiah, so sometime around 621 BC. But this verse was most likely written during the Babylonian exile, probably around 587 BC. And so that means that this verse is over 200 years out of place. Also, we don't know who wrote it. It may not have been written by Moses at all, and so it really isn't a good source for trying to figure out how ancient people viewed Yahweh. And so those are the main arguments that proponents of the Yahweh in Canaan theory use. They believe that there were definitely other people besides the Israelites who knew Yahweh and worshipped Him. And their argument is mostly based on the fact that the Bible doesn't explicitly say that Yahweh worship was unique to Israel. Okay, so now let's move on to the second theory. And like I mentioned, I'm going to call this theory the Israelite exclusivity theory. And the basic idea behind this theory is that from creation until the time of Moses, Yahweh was the God of Israel, and there were no other gods in existence. And the main piece of evidence for this theory is Deuteronomy 4:35. Here Moses is saying this to the Israelites. "To you is the sonship of God near. He has not rejected you or despised you, nor been afraid of you, as the sons of Israel. He chose you and commanded you to keep His charge, that you might be a people of His own inheritance, a holy nation, a peculiar treasure above all the nations He made." In this passage, Moses is saying that God chose Israel to be His own special possession, His own inheritance. And if that's true, then Israel was chosen to worship Yahweh. Yahweh was not just given to Israel, but He was also given to nobody else. So in other words, Israel did not inherit Yahweh. Yahweh inherited them. And so this passage is the main piece of evidence used by proponents of this theory. However, there is another argument that proponents of this theory will make, and that is that the Bible simply never mentions anyone else worshiping Yahweh, and so some people use that silence as evidence for their case. The Bible never talks about other people worshiping Yahweh. Therefore, according to this theory, Yahweh was unique to Israel. Nobody else knew Him. However, as we already saw earlier, there are passages like Exodus 3-6, 7 and Hebrews 11-3 that seem to indicate that other people did indeed worship Yahweh. But if you reject those passages, then you have a much stronger case. The Bible is pretty clear that Israel was God's chosen people. That doesn't mean that other people couldn't have worshipped God, but it does mean that Yahweh was given to Israel exclusively. So in the end, which theory do you think is correct? Is it the Yahweh in Canaan theory, or is it the Israeli exclusivity theory? Well, that's for you to decide. My goal was not to prove either of these theories right or wrong. My goal was simply to present both theories and let you come to your own conclusions. As for me, I believe that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the one and only true God, and I believe that He chose Israel, and He chose them for a purpose. That purpose has not ended. Israel still has a purpose today, but I also believe that God is big enough and powerful enough and good enough to where He can work outside of His will. So I believe that even though God's was to choose Israel, His purpose could extend beyond Israel. So I guess that makes me kind of in the middle on this issue. But again, I don't think that the Bible teaches that the worship of Yahweh was ever exclusive to the nation of Israel. But I also don't think that the Bible teaches that there were other nations that were worshiping the God of Israel. We've spent the last several videos examining the recently published findings at Tel Dan and what they might mean for the history of the religion of the Israelites and their God, Yahweh. The possible implications have been staggering, from the political situation of ancient Judah to the nature of the relationship between Israel and Rome, from the role that Yahweh played in the destruction of the northern kingdom to the development of the figure of Jesus Christ. We've tried to take a balanced look at both the potential and the problems with these new findings and the conclusions that have been drawn from them. But now it's time to step back and take an even longer view. In this final video on the subject, I want to talk about the big picture, not just for the history of the Israelites or the history of Judaism, but for the history of our entire world and for Christianity as well. What if the history of the Israelite religion wasn't a simple linear narrative where everything we know about their religion is found in the Bible? What if there were things that happened before Moses that we don't know about? What if the Israelites didn't just pop out of nowhere fully formed with their God and their laws and their beliefs? What if, in fact, their religion evolved over time like every other religion we know about? And what would that mean for us today? The first thing that we need to get out of the way is the idea that we can be certain about anything. When it comes to the distant past, the earliest records we have about the Israelites come from the Egyptians during the reign of Ramses II, who lived around 1279 to 1213 BCE. But these records are mostly about the people of Israel as a nation, as a group that conquered Canaan and set up their own kingdom there. There's very little said about their God, Yahweh, except that He is apparently one of many gods that the Egyptians knew about. In fact, throughout the entire region, we only find evidence of a deity named Yahweh at one place, and one place only, at Tel Dan in the northern part of the ancient land of Israel. This is significant because the name Yahweh doesn't appear anywhere outside of the Hebrew Bible, except here. This tells us something very important about how we should think about the history of Yahweh. He isn't this guy who just shows up in the desert with Moses, and suddenly everyone in the area knows who He is and bows down to Him. That would be absurd. Yahweh was known in the region long before Moses, and He was worshipped at places like Tel Dan long before the Israelites settled in Canaan. What does this mean for the history of Judaism and the Old Testament? It means that we can no longer say with a straight face that the book of Exodus is historical. There's simply no way that the entire religion of the Israelites can have sprung into being in just a few chapters in the middle of the book of Exodus. There were hundreds of years of history before Moses, and we know that now. Even if you think that the Bible is true, how could you believe that everything that happened before Moses is recorded in those first 11 chapters of Genesis? That makes no sense. So either the Bible is wrong and those stories never happened, or there were hundreds of years of history that we know nothing about, because the Bible ignores them completely. And the most likely explanation is that the Bible is simply ignorant of that history. It doesn't know anything about the history of its own religion. This is also very good news for those of us who believe in the New Testament, because it once again demonstrates that the Bible doesn't know its own history. If we can't trust the Bible to tell us anything about the history of the Israelites and Yahweh, why would we trust it to tell us anything about the history of Jesus? You can't. We can't. And this is coming from someone who believes that the Bible is true. So then how did the religion of the Israelites develop? Well, unfortunately, we don't know. We simply don't have the evidence to answer that question. We do know that the Israelites weren't the only ones worshiping Yahweh. In fact, there were dozens of tribes and nations in the region who worshipped him along with many others. And we know that many of them continued to worship him after the kingdoms of Israel and Judah fell to the Babylonians and then the Persians. It's very likely that Yahweh started off as a local god of one of the smaller tribes in the region, and that his worship spread outwards from there. This would explain why there are so many different names for God in the Old Testament. Elohim, El Shaddai, Adonai, Yahweh. They all seem to come from different traditions that eventually came together under the name Yahweh. And it would also explain why there were so many different versions of the same story. The story of Adam and Eve, for example, is told 5 different times in the book of Genesis, each time with slightly different details. These are likely different versions of the same story that were combined and written down during the process of standardization. There was a lot going on in the ancient world. As more and more people moved into the region, as new kings rose to power, as old traditions were forgotten and new ones took their place, as local cults became larger and more important, Yahweh grew unchanged as well. He was a sky god at first, but over time he became more of a warrior god. And finally, as the monarchy grew weaker and the people needed something to hold on to, he became a law-giving king. And all of this was happening at the same time that the religion of the surrounding nations was also changing. Many of them had once worshipped one god, but they had turned to polytheism by the time of Moses. Others had begun to turn away from the old ways entirely, choosing instead to follow the new Mesopotamian religions. And still others were being forced to worship strange gods that had nothing to do with Abraham or Isaac. This would have created a crisis for the Israelites, a crisis of identity. Who were they if they weren't a people with a special relationship to a special God? But Yahweh gave them the Torah at Sinai, and that was enough. The Torah told them who they were, where they came from, why they were there, and what they were supposed to do. It was a history that explained their past, and a law that told them how to live in the present. And it gave them hope for the future. The Torah made it clear that even though their history was long and complicated, even though their origins were mysterious, and their identity was constantly being threatened, Yahweh had chosen them and set them apart. They were his people, and he would never let go of them. I know this sounds like speculation, but it's really not. This is how religions develop. I've studied the history of religions for more than a decade, and I can tell you that this is a normal process. Every religion we know about went through these stages. It's easy to forget that because we don't see these processes happen very often anymore. But they're everywhere in the ancient texts. Just look at the way that the Greeks and Romans adapted the gods they found in Egypt and Mesopotamia to fit their own culture. Or look at how the Egyptians transformed the foreign gods they encountered in the Levant and the Aegean into pharaohs. Religions change over time. Yahweh wasn't the exception, and yet sometimes people insist on pretending that he was. They want to believe that he just popped out of nowhere fully formed, that he always existed and will always exist. That's called revelation, and it's not how religions normally work. So where does that leave us? What does this discovery tell us about the nature of reality? Not much. Actually, it doesn't tell us anything about heaven or hell or the devil. It doesn't tell us anything about the existence or non-existence of God. It doesn't even tell us anything about the nature of Yahweh. All it tells us is that the history of Yahweh is longer and more complicated than we thought it was. But that's okay, because we already knew that. It's not about what it tells us, it's about what it doesn't tell us. The Bible wants us to believe that the history of Yahweh began with Moses and ended with Malachi, but the archaeology tells us otherwise. There were hundreds of years of history before Moses, and the worship of Yahweh continued long after Malachi. So what are we to make of this? Are we supposed to believe the Bible or the archaeologists? Well, I'm afraid you're going to have to decide that for yourself. But I would encourage you to remember that the Bible doesn't know its own history. It couldn't possibly know the history of the ancient Near East. And what we're learning from the archaeological record is simply that the history of Yahweh is older and more complicated than the Bible would have us believe. There's a lot more to say, a lot more questions to ask, and a lot more research to be done. But until then, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something, and I look forward to seeing you next week.